Thank you so much. It is so nice to be here with all of you today, and just really appreciate the technical expertise and the knowledge, the on-the-ground knowledge and experience in this room, and just really grateful for your dedication to the fire crisis in California. I took this job in 2019. I had been on the ground volunteering in the aftermath of the Camp Fire in Paradise, and just saw the scale of devastation in a community that I had grown up knowing and loving. I saw that level of devastation that I just hadn't seen since I had been living in an active war zone in Iraq, and the level of trauma that was coming through to our communities. And so that's why I wanted to commit myself, the way all of you have, to how do we really tackle this crisis so that we're not experiencing that level of trauma, devastation from a system that is originally supposed to be a natural part of our ecology, right? All of you understand that California's wildlands were actively managed with fire by tribes for millennia, and that these are fire-adapted ecologies, but they are not adapted to the catastrophic mega fires that we are seeing today. And so the question we're trying to solve is, how do we actually get back to natural fire regimes that play their ecological role, in which communities and ecologies are not only safe but thriving. We understand this for rain and flooding, right? We understand the difference between natural rain cycles versus, the sort of predicted catastrophic mega flood that is coming for us any day, according to Daniel Swain. And so we watch, we understand sort of that difference. But when it comes to fire, there's not always that nuance in the public conversation. I'm sure in the conversations you all are having as experts, that is coming through. But we need to be able to get to a point where we don't have no fire on the landscape, but we have safe, healthy fire on the landscape. And so I think most of you probably know California Natural Resources Agency is the parent agency at the state for CAL FIRE, state parks, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and 26 of our departments that have a direct role in tackling part of the fire crisis. And so what we've been trying to do is get to a point where we can actually get ahead of the curve. Because the challenge we're seeing is that the fires we're experiencing are not the fires that I saw growing up. I mean, just show of hands. For how many of you the fires of the last 5 years just felt really different? Exactly. And so we know that there's already a foundation that, in terms of a foundation that led us to this point, but what we're seeing is overly dense forests, the legacy of fire suppression, added onto climate change, takes that overly dense landscape where the forests are competing with each other, and that incredibly dense competition, that they then cannot withstand the extreme conditions that climate change is putting them under, whether it's extreme heat, extreme drought, that weakens them. And that's where you get things like mass tree die-off, and things like 6% fuel moisture like we had last week after that, or week before last after the extreme heat wave came through, where you get these incredibly dry conditions that are then ripe for mega fires. And so we are working to figure out, how do you arrest what is then a compounding climate cycle? The best example I have of that sort of forest health and fire suppression legacy combining with climate change in a devastating way is the Creek Fire in 2020. How many of you guys are familiar with or know the Creek Fire? Some hands, okay. For me, it's just an example, but I'm sure that many of you could point to one in your own community that you saw come into effect. But I think this really demonstrates the climate loop that we're gonna be in if we don't get this in hand in California. So the Creek Fire was down in Shaver Lake in 2020, and it was an area where you had 90% tree mortality. So you had overly dense forests, legacy of clear cutting, early 1900s, trees grew back far too dense. Dr. Malcolm North and Scott Stevens both put out a paper recently that was saying in these areas you should have 40 trees per acre, instead you were having 400, right? So they're competing with each other. Then you get our once in millennia drought that we're still still in, but started in 2012. And between 2012 and 2015, you had 169 million trees die throughout the Sierra. Those, and in the Shaver Lake area and the Southern Sierra, you had some areas of 90% tree mortality. And they died directly from the beetle kill, but it's really the drought and the competition, right? The trees couldn't withstand the drought, didn't have enough sap to push those beetles out. So what you ended up with is these larger diameter trees that were getting targeted in the tree die-off. Well, by the time 2020 rolled around, those dead standing trees were now ground fuel. They fell over. And so instead of our ground fuel models being 3-inch diameters, you had 30-inch diameter trees on the ground creating that fuel bed. And so when the fire came through after another extreme heat wave, just like we had a few weeks ago, where you clocked in that 130-degree temperature in Death Valley. Do you guys remember this heat wave in 2020 across the state? And so that dried out that dead fuel moisture to around 6%. And so kiln dried wood is 12% fuel moisture. So what you were getting was professionally dried wood on the landscape, on the ground, in a density that was unprecedented and beyond what any of our models take into account for ground fuel. The fire broke out, and the creek fire was this enormous 50,000-foot pyrocumulus. So it was that huge weather system. It burned so hot. It was a phenomenon called standing combustion that fire scientists, when they look at models and real-life examples of that active flame throughout the fire footprint, rather than a smoldering middle and a flaming front, you had an active flame throughout the entire footprint of that creek fire. That's what created the heat signature to create that pyrocumulus, which is then what created this pillar that then collapsed and pushed out hurricane force winds in a circumference in every direction, so you didn't just have one fire front. The firefighters on the ground told me they knew the column was collapsing when they saw limbs the size of small trees falling from the sky that had been sort of sucked up into that. And so what you're getting are these really difficult fuel-driven fires that are creating their own weather conditions that then exacerbate the fire conditions on the ground, making it very hard for evacuation. And this summer, we saw a number of pyrocumulus around the state of different scales, including the McKinney fire. And so what's hard about the creek fire, though, and what was really striking to me is when I talked to fire scientists, they said that they did not have a real-life example of standing combustion across that fire footprint, with the exception, at that scale, with the exception of the Tokyo fire bombings and the bombings of Dresden. That's what our communities, our upper watersheds are going through. It's an attack level assault on our watersheds. What happens then is that fire burned at such high severity and intensity that instead of having forests just naturally come back, you're getting the vegetation type change. And so when it's converting to shrubs or even not coming back at all, right? The first year after the creek fire, it was still mostly barren. It was the very black. You didn't start getting that sort of new green coming back because it had been such a dry winter following it. And so what you're seeing is that then those fire scars, then you get incredible devastation across the watershed. And our upper watersheds are a really crucial and often overlooked portion of our natural infrastructure to make our state drought resilient, right? The mountains are actually designed to be reservoirs, not just the reservoirs or the dams. And so making sure that the soil quality, the forest quality is still intact to ensure that forest hydrology is functioning so that our upper watersheds are actually producing the level of water yield and water storage that we need throughout the year. When you have something like the creek fire that comes through and nukes your watershed, and we saw this again in the Dixie fire and the Caldor fire and the Tamarack fire, right? Critical upper watersheds, high severity burns, where you're getting a phenomenon called hydrophobic soil, right? In the Dixie fire, the water just wasn't even penetrating because the soil had burned so hot it turned to clay. And so it's just running straight off the top and down and then not penetrating into the watershed. So what that then does is it further exacerbates drought conditions, which then further exacerbates fire conditions. And you start getting into this compounding climate cycle that you can't get out of. And so The question we're tackling is, how do you get out of that? How do you make sure that our communities, our ecologies, our watersheds are resilient to not only past conditions, but the future conditions that we're going to be facing? And the beauty of forests, and this is what you guys all know on the fire crisis, forests, wildlands, communities, is that this is solvable. Right? We know that if we get our forests back to a density and a structure that they can actually then withstand the hotter conditions and the drier conditions, when you restore natural fire, then when fire strikes, it has its ecological natural role. You're not getting those crown fires. We know that there are ways that we can actually alter our homes and our buildings so that when ember-driven fires are coming through at high wind events, that the embers are hitting it and not igniting and not getting in those attics and under eaves. And so there are things we can do to change this. And so that's what the state is investing in. So we have taken an all-hands-on-deck approach and said, what happens when we actually invest at the scale of suppression in prevention? And in preventing the crisis, not preventing fire. We want good fire. I want to be really clear. Hope that's coming through. But what we're investing in is in that level of resilience. And when we talk about resilience, there's 3 fronts that the state's investing in that we find effective. And all of you know this, but one point I try to emphasize to the public, and I hope you'll join me in doing it, is that all 3 of these resilience fronts are critical. If you only have one standing alone, it won't do it, right? These are things, it's almost analogous to safety features on cars, right? You need your seat belts, you need your anti-lock brakes, and you need your airbags. And when you have those in place, car accidents are less devastating and sometimes avoided. But if a car goes off a cliff, those resilience efforts maybe won't help as much. So I try to sort of temper how we talk about it, but also remind people that you need all 3. So the 3 fronts of resilience that the state is investing in are inside of communities, so that's your home hardening, your defensible space, to ensure that structures and the way communities are set up are going to be both safe for evacuation, but also less likely to ignite during a fire, especially during those ember-driven fires. We put infrastructure, so then we invest around communities. That's your next layer. And that's going to be your strategic fuel breaks around communities that give firefighters that tactical advantage during a firefight and also enable safe evacuation during a large fire. And then the last area is across the landscape, so across those whole watersheds, so that we're restoring natural ecologies and natural fire return intervals so that the fires, when they strike, play their ecological role instead of these devastating high-intensity crown fires. And so when you get all 3 of those in place, then when fire happens, it is playing its natural role. The community is fine. People can go about their lives. And so we are investing at an unprecedented scale on this front. The first time the state had direct funding for wildfire resilience was in 2018, after the Camp Fire. We got SB 901, and that allowed us to be able to have $200 million a year in base funding for wildfire resilience. Last year, we increased that to $1.5 billion. And this was a huge surge, and we expanded it so that it went across 40 different types of wildfire resilience programs and implemented by 22 different state agencies. We basically took all the state agencies that had been getting grants from CAL FIRE to do this work and gave them their own direct appropriation and surged these programs that we found effective so that we could actually hit a scale that could potentially start to match the scale of the fire crisis. What I'm really excited to announce is that just last week, the governor signed the budget, which included an additional $1.3 billion for wildfire resilience activities and programs throughout the state. So that means that over 3 years, we'll now have $2.8 billion just in resilience activities. And yeah, it's huge. So let me take a minute and walk you guys through where those dollars are and what types of programs those are targeting, so that you know what you should be looking for. Because you guys are all, like, our local partners on the ground are really crucial in making this effective. So we have programs that are across those 3 fronts of resilience. So for example, at the landscape level, we're targeting the different ownership types, because all of you know a fire doesn't pause at a jurisdictional boundary and say, oh, federal land, better go around. And so what we do is we're making sure that we're investing, that we have resources available for every land ownership type, and then investments in collaboration and local planning, so that then those cross-jurisdictional resources can fund a contiguous strategy. So across land ownership types, we have funding for state-owned land, our state parks, and Department of Fish and Wildlife lands. The state owns about 3% of the land in California. We want to make sure that that land, which is incredibly unique biodiversity, is well protected. So got direct funding for those programs. We also want to make sure that there's funding for small landowners. 25% of the forested land in California is owned in parcels that are 1,000 acres or less. So those small family landowners, a lot of those are 50 acres, you know, those little plots. And you guys have all seen them, those little mosaics. And what you don't want is to have a fire come through and then have beautifully treated public land, and then the private land from these small families is ignored. And then burns its severity and kind of breaks down your system. So what we did is we invested in the California Forest Improvement Program, which gives direct grants to small forested landowners and technical assistance so that they can actually get their land in shape as well. We also have funding for larger industrial landowners in something called the Forest Legacy Program. So if they commit to keep that land as forest land and not convert it to housing or some other sort of form, and to manage it in a way that hits a couple biodiversity targets, then that gets funding under Forest Legacy. So they're committing to ensuring that that forest stays forest in perpetuity and is managed sustainably. We also have funding across that sort of spans jurisdictions. Our CAL FIRE Forest Health Grants are really crucial. I think you'll hear about them later. And those programs go out to partners throughout the state, and it's huge. I mean, it's over $300 million in forest health grants that are getting out the door, and that's really targeted to hit all of our targets there. So the next level is around communities, so that's going to be your strategic fuel breaks. So that's going to be like CAL FIRE's fire prevention grants. Those go to communities to put fuel breaks in place, and our state conservancies also do a lot, both across landscapes and around communities, making sure that you have the shaded fuel breaks. And then the last area is home hardening defensible space. So we've expanded investments in the UC Fire Advisors to make sure that fire-wise communities, fire safe councils, local planners have access to the best science and good technical support to make good community decisions. We're also investing in defensible space. We just expanded our defensible space standards in California, or in the process of doing it, so that we have a new 0 to 5 foot non-flammable zone. So that you'd have no sort of wooden fences right against your home like we saw in the Marshall Fire. And so we increased our defensible space inspectors, and then we're adding in a new program that is specific for community hardening. That's a partnership with FEMA, and so this will be over $100 million program. We're starting out in 3 counties where we're targeting the highest vulnerability, lowest income neighborhoods to do a full saturation of home hardening and defensible space on those neighborhoods. So because we know that if you do great defensible space and home hardening on your home, but the neighbor didn't do it on theirs, that heat signature is going to wipe out any of the good work you did. So we're trying to make sure that you get almost a herd immunity when it comes to home hardening and defensible space in communities. And then in addition, we're investing in areas that are focused on making sure that we're actually increasing the speed and the structure. Because it's all nice on paper if you're like, great, the state has a lot of money, and there's always a danger with government that the money could just then sit for a couple years as good ideas on paper and then eventually trickle out, right? We didn't want to have that happen because the fire was not going to wait for our budget cycles, our contracting cycles, our grant cycles, that we wanted to ensure that we were moving at a speed that was nimble. So there are a couple things that we did in this appropriation that I think would be really helpful to replicate both at the federal level and also make sure that we continue in California. So we changed the appropriation timeline on the dollars from 2 years to 7 years. And I know that sounds really wonky, but what that can do is it allows us to give out much larger grants so that our grantees who are taking on a whole watershed, like the Yuba River watershed, for example, they don't have to come back 4 times to apply for one grant to be able to finish one large project. Instead, you can give them one large grant, go finish this project, and then it also helps the state stabilize the rural economy so that that grantee could then hire someone for 7 years rather than 2. They could then give out the wood supply and the feedstock material that's coming off of their project. They can give that supply chain agreement out for 7 years. So you're creating some predictability and stability in the rural economies that we're trying to jumpstart while we're doing these fire resilience just by changing state business practices. And I'll be actually really interested to hear more if this is a new piece, so I'll be excited to hear sort of feedback from you guys on the local level, you know, to what extent that is having the intended impact. Other things that we've done, we changed, we got a contracting relief in the legislation that allowed us to take our state procurement timelines from a year down to 4 weeks. And so that meant that we could get projects on the ground much more quickly. The other thing we did is invested in regulatory reform. How many of you have heard of CEQA? Okay, I hear some groans and terror. Excellent. And so, you know, California's environmental protections were designed to be able to protect the environment from people, but they're not as nimble at allowing people to protect the environment from climate change. And so the question we're having is, how do you ensure that environmental responsibility and stewardship that we're having, anticipating where there could be environmental consequences and mitigating for those, while being nimble enough to actually protect our climate. And so I want to make sure that, so what we've done is we did a couple things, because you have CEQA and then there's other permits too that you need to do wildfire resilience projects. You need a permit from Fish and Wildlife or a permit from state water boards. And so what we did is we did a pre-environmental review across 20 million acres across the state. It's called the CalVTP, the California Vegetation Treatment Programmatic Environmental Impact Review. There you go. And it was a 20 million acre review across all of the high fire risk non-federal land in the state. So pretty much anywhere that a state grant would trigger CEQA, we did a pre-environmental review on it. What that means is that now, because that analysis was already done, you can go out with your project and actually just identify the environmental mitigations you need to take and agree to follow them, and you're done. And so it's just an actual boots on the ground substantive environmental review without all of the sort of additional steps. What was particularly revolutionary on this front is that state water boards agreed to create because we funded their staffing to do this, so that meant they didn't need an additional permit. Because their environmental mitigations were already incorporated into the CalVTP, they created a single permit that then, statewide permit, which is automatic enrollment into the CalVTP. So you get your CEQA and your water boards just by sort of doing this one process. Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad to see other policy nerds out there. But the goal is for this to be faster, and then the Department of Fish and Wildlife took an equally innovative but different tactic, where they said, hey, if you're doing fuel reduction or landscape thinning or reforestation or a prescribed burn, that's generally not going to be a problem for environmental species, and you can for endangered species and habitat takes, so you can actually mitigate around it. So they built into the CalVTP all the mitigations that then you avoid triggering their permits. You're just not going to have the environmental impact of triggering their permits. So it's essentially 3 permitting processes looped into one environmental review. And I know you're going to say, but Jessica, that's a 1,000-page document. How am I going to learn this whole new process? We solved that too, hopefully. So what we've got is a contract with an environmental consulting firm who were the authors of the CalVTP to go and do about 100 CalVTP projects, what's called a project-specific analysis, to do the local environmental review, tearing off this document across every landscape, jurisdiction in the state. So there's going to be a very easy template now to follow, and my goal is to actually keep that environmental consulting contract going, so that what we're doing is just constantly now creating a pipeline so that our project partners can have their environmental review done and done by professionals before they come to us for a grant. Because if we're going to be scaling up to 1 million acres a year treated in California, we want to make sure that we're doing it right and science-based. And so I see I still have 8 minutes left. I see you were giving me a 5-minute signal and that one's 8. Any? Go to the 8. Okay. All right. Okay. And so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting off the rest of our panel here, because we have amazing thinkers here. So what I hope you're hearing though is that we're trying to scale up to that 1 million acres. We want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is smart, is safe, and actually doesn't, and that we're anticipating and mitigating any environmental consequences from it, right? We don't want to have happen what happened 100 years ago with the fire suppression policy, where they were like, well, this is a good political decision in 1905 to keep the Forest Service going, but turns out 100 years later, terrible choice for the rest of us. And so I want to make sure that we are making science-based decisions that allow us to not only have a good impact right now and to keep us safe right now, but also 100 years from now we're anticipating and have mitigated against potential hurdles and challenges. There's a couple other areas that we're investing in. For this to work, California's ecology is so unique and diverse that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach here. And so what we're doing is investing in regional collaboratives. So we're investing in regional staffing, regional planning. It's often through a resource conservation district or a local partner. And that gives us the staffing and the planning dollars to be able to ensure that you have a contiguous impact across the landscape. So I'll give you an example. Like in San Diego County, they were an early pilot of this regional forest and fire capacity program. And so when we got the funding last year, they had already had staffing in place through the Resource Conservation District and the State Conservancy in San Diego. And they had already identified a strategic plan for the whole county across jurisdictional boundaries. They had plans for state land, federal land, knew where the fuel breaks needed to go. And so what that meant is that when we got dollars, both the State Conservancy through the fire resilience funding and CAL FIRE grants and CAL FIRE direct dollars and state park funding, that when all of these dollars came available, we were able to plug into a contiguous program that was already designed for that county. So we put in strategic fuel breaks around neighborhoods. We helped restore a couple burned out areas from previous fires to make those more resilient and help shore up some of the watershed. We invested in a community home hardening and community chipping program there. And because we had all of these tools in place to get projects on the ground quickly, it usually would take us about a year from getting an appropriation to getting a project on the ground. We actually had projects in place by last fire season. So there was a fire that broke out in San Diego, or in the city of Santee, on Thanksgiving Day. Red flag warning day, 18-acre fire bearing down on a neighborhood. It hit one of the fuel breaks that we had gotten in place with last year's money, that had gotten on the ground in just a couple weeks. And CAL FIRE was able to hold it off of that neighborhood and hold it out. And because you had already had the neighborhood chipping done, you didn't have ignitions from embers then coming into the neighborhood. And so what we're seeing is that our nimbleness is allowing us to be able to get projects on the ground that are both strategic, well coordinated, and nimble. And so with the funding we got last year, we've already launched over 1,000 projects throughout the state, many of which caught fires this year, which was pretty phenomenal. I stood at the Electra fire, which broke out on 4th of July in Amador County. And that one was kicking off a pyrocumulus. It was looking like it was going to be pretty gnarly. And day one of that fire, it actually hit a strategic fuel break that we had in place from this funding. And I stood there. It was an oak woodland, so it was basically a restored. It had restored these beautiful oak trees along an 8-mile long fuel break. And so the fire, high severity coming up the canyon, hit the fuel reduction project. The oak trees are still green. It was black underneath, burned to a road, and was out. And so I stood there, and it's one of those stark lines where you just see, black and then unburned grass on the other side, and the homes were still standing. And then luck did come in for us, because a few days later, as they had that containment line, we got some better humidity overnight, and they were able to then continue to get full containment on it. But there was a lot of fires that would have been very big this year that we were grateful weren't, because of these efforts that had been put in place. The last area that I want to highlight in the last couple of minutes here is that economic development piece, because that's really crucial to our success, is that we need this to be able to sustain, and we also need to be able to have a destination for the woody material coming out of the forests. That open pile burning is not going to be a sustainable solution, because as you get drier, longer, fewer and farther between sort of complex burn windows, it's hard to burn off those slash piles in a timely way. And what we see is that we have to put fire engines and fire crews on slash piles during firefights, because you'll have some that are like the size of this room, and that are just enormous. And so, and they can complicate wildfires. We also have seen that even when you have small slash piles spread out, they're not rotting the way they used to, right? Historically, it was fine to sort of pile them up and then let them decompose after a few years. You're not getting the right moisture levels to decompose them consistently. And so removing them out is going to be a much better destination. And so we're a little bit agnostic in terms of what technology. We have the Joint Institute for Wood Products Innovation at the Board of Forestry, and they help us identify the coolest technologies that can use this. Everything from, well, we can take your slash pile and turn it into jet fuel, or carbon negative liquid hydrogen, or you can turn it into liquefied natural gas, or mass timber, for replacing steel and concrete in buildings. And so the array, and also traditional, like lumber sequesters 80% of the carbon, turns out. And so even just increasing mill capacity or even smaller diameter mill capacity is really crucial. So we're making sure that we are investing in a couple areas on that front. We're investing in access to capital. So the California Infrastructure Bank is now doing low interest loans for larger businesses that are going to consume woody material and utilize it. We're investing in small business loans and workforce development grants through CAL FIRE, so that we can get those projects out on the ground, and you can open up like a micro mill in your backyard, or something like we had up in Crescent Mills outside of Greenville. We opened up a small mill so the wood only goes 5 miles instead of 80, and then right back to the community to rebuild. And so we're investing in those loans and grants. We also have a much larger $50 million innovation grant program at Department of Conservation for technology that is somewhat proven, but not really proven on the market yet, to be able to take carbon negative cycles with that woody material. And then the last area we're doing is, because the state owns very little of this land, so unlike the Forest Service, we can't give out 20-year supply agreements to say, congratulations, get your wood from us, please open a product facility. Instead, what we're doing is feedstock aggregation. So we're taking all of our small grants and creating these pilots of woody feedstock brokers across the state, who can then aggregate all of the smaller projects and then give out 10-year supply agreements to private businesses, trying to stabilize this market base. So we're trying to increase that, and then we're also increasing the workforce, everything through the Conservation Corps and programs that you're going to hear about a little bit later. But workforce development is a really crucial piece of this, because we can't grow and expand and sustain this pace without the skilled labor force to do it. So everything from the conservation fuels crews on the ground, prescribed burners, professional foresters, to machine operators who can do the masticators and the heavy hauling. So we're trying to get this entire spectrum off the ground. So I'm really grateful to be able to partner with you. Thank you for getting the full tour of California's wildfire resilience investment. I hope that you're taking advantage of these funds, and I'm really happy to talk to you more or point you in the right direction to make sure that they're trickling out to all of your communities and really having the fire resilience impact. So we're going to be in this together, and look forward to 100 years from now, everybody looking back at all of us and saying, hey, they did it right. So thank you.